Here are the 6 oil painting heuristics I use to create colorful impressionist pieces. I'm a self-taught painter who likes to use colors straight from the tube applied with a palette knife to create vibrant scenes and landscapes, and these are the tips that I wish I had learned sooner when starting my artistic journey. The biggest tip is that you should try to start painting crude to fine. Get your big shapes down before you do any details or rendering, that way you won't lose the forest for the trees. This is one of the reasons I really like using a palette knife, because it forces you to paint crudely. Second is to avoid mixing browns or grays, with a catch in the next tip. Although I like to generally paint straight from the tube with amendments in value with white, I will spend a decent amount of time mixing a small amount of another pigment into the paint, but you have to be really careful. If you overmix pigments, then you end up with brown or gray, and that needs to be used strategically. That brings me to my next rule of thumb, which is the 70-30 rule. The 70-30 rule states that you should try to alternate in a 7:3 ratio any of your crude to fine elements or your main colors and your accents. I find that it makes our eyes gravitate towards those things that are in contrast. And speaking of browns and grays, sometimes I will use those as that 30% in contrast to the more vibrant colors that you might get straight from the tube. A painting always looks more finished to me when I maintain the level of detail throughout the piece. If you have a really crude painting all the way across, it often will look more complete than if you had a lot of crude brush strokes and only had a small amount of fine detail work. But if I do 30% of fine brush strokes or palette knife strokes, or 30% of that painting with line work, it makes the piece feel even more finished. The fourth tip kind of goes back to the first tip in that you should try to get your values and blocking right as early as you can. This builds on crude to fine. If you squint and blur your eyes at your piece, you should be able to get the sense of whether or not things are trending in the right direction, solely based on how light and dark certain elements of your painting are. The fifth heuristic I use is the principle of thick over thin, in which I will apply a certain amount of solvents and mediums at different stages of my painting. Generally touted as a way to prevent cracking in an oil painting, I think that working thick over thin enables us to have a more streamlined workflow, because I will usually use solvent to thin the paint in the early stages so that I can more rapidly iterate on this quickly drying paint and get my blocking done before I move on to maybe the thicker, more finished layers. Finally, I like to use the rule of thirds and the golden ratio armature when selecting a composition for my painting, which generally states that you want to put focal points and points of interest along those thirds or along those lines in the golden ratio armature. That enables our eye to most closely follow a pleasing pattern. Follow me here for more art tips.